At a family dinner, my nephew tried to embarrass me for not lending him money. He smirked and said, "Family helps each other." I stood up, pulled out my phone, and said, "Then explain this." His face went pale when he saw that. I, 34M, sat at the family dinner table, watching my nephew's smug expression as he launched into his performance. The whole extended family was there: parents, siblings, cousins, aunts and uncles, gathered for our monthly get-together at my sister's house. What started as pleasant conversation over roast chicken had taken an ugly turn when my nephew decided to make me his target. He'd approached me earlier that week asking for $5,000 to help with what he called a business venture. I'd politely declined after doing some research and discovering his so-called business was actually a pyramid scheme that had already collapsed in 3 other states. But apparently, my refusal had wounded his pride more than I'd realized. Now he was putting on a show for the entire family, his voice getting louder with each word as he painted me as the selfish uncle who refused to help family in need. He talked about how I lived alone in my nice house, drove a decent car, and clearly had money to spare, but wouldn't lift a finger to help my own blood. The worst part was watching some family members nodding along, their expressions growing disapproving as they looked in my direction. My nephew leaned back in his chair with that infuriating smirk plastered across his face and delivered what he thought was his killing blow. He reminded everyone that family helps each other, that blood is thicker than water, and that real family members don't turn their backs when someone needs help. The implication was clear: I wasn't a real family member. The room fell silent except for the soft clink of silverware against plates. I could feel every pair of eyes on me, waiting for my response. My sister looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. My parents seemed torn between disappointment and confusion. My nephew sat there basking in what he thought was his moment of triumph. That's when I stood up slowly, reached into my pocket, and pulled out my phone. I'd been hoping I wouldn't have to use what I'd discovered, but he'd forced my hand. I told him that if family really helped each other, then perhaps he could explain something to everyone. The color drained from his face as I turned my phone screen toward the table. What they saw was a screenshot of a Facebook Marketplace listing from 3 days ago, my nephew selling a gaming console, high-end headphones, and designer sneakers. The total value of items he was selling was close to $3,000. But that wasn't even the most damning part. I swiped to the next screenshot, which showed his Instagram story from the same day he'd asked me for money. There he was at an expensive steakhouse, showing off a bottle of wine that cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget. The story was tagged with his location and included shots of his meal, his designer watch, and him bragging about his successful night out. The silence in the room was deafening. I watched as family members leaned forward to get a better look at my phone screen, their expressions shifting from confusion to understanding to outright anger. My nephew's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no words came out. I continued scrolling through the evidence I'd gathered. There were more Instagram posts showing his expensive lifestyle, designer clothes, frequent trips to high-end restaurants, a weekend getaway to a luxury resort just 2 weeks ago. For someone who claimed to be desperately in need of money for a business opportunity, he certainly lived like someone with plenty of disposable income. But the real kicker was the final screenshot, a text message conversation between him and his friend discussing their plans to scam family members out of money to fund their party lifestyle. In the messages, he'd laughed about how easy it would be to guilt-trip relatives into giving him cash, specifically mentioning how he planned to target me because I lived alone and probably felt lonely enough to pay for family approval. The room erupted. My sister demanded to know what was going on. My parents started asking pointed questions about where he'd gotten money for all these purchases if he was supposedly broke. Other family members began sharing their own stories of times he'd asked them for money, painting a picture of a pattern of manipulation that had been going on for months. My nephew finally found his voice and tried to deflect, claiming the screenshots were fake or taken out of context. He insisted that he really did need the money for legitimate reasons, and that his lifestyle posts were just him trying to maintain appearances. But his explanations became increasingly desperate and contradictory as more family members started putting pieces together. My aunt mentioned how he'd borrowed $200 from her last month claiming his car needed repairs, yet she'd seen him at the casino that same weekend. My cousin talked about lending him money for textbooks, only to discover he'd dropped out of college months earlier. The stories kept coming. each one revealing another layer of deception. What really sealed his fate was when my tech-savvy teenage cousin offered to verify the authenticity of the screenshots. Within minutes, she'd pulled up his actual social media accounts and confirmed that everything I'd shown was real and recent. There was no denying the evidence anymore. The confrontation that followed was brutal. Family members who had been ready to shame me for not helping were now directing their anger at my nephew for his manipulation and lies. My sister was mortified that her son had tried to scam his own uncle and demanded he apologize immediately. But I wasn't finished. I'd spent the week since his request doing thorough research, and I had one more revelation that would ensure he never tried this again. I pulled up another set of screenshots showing his involvement in the pyramid scheme I'd investigated. Not only was he trying to recruit family members as potential victims, but he'd already lost significant money in the scheme himself, money he'd borrowed from other relatives under false pretenses. The scheme was called Digital Dynasty and promised massive returns for recruiting others to sell overpriced digital marketing courses. I'd found records showing he'd paid a $3,000 entry fee and had been desperately trying to recruit enough people to break even. His business opportunity that he'd wanted me to invest in wasn't a legitimate venture. It was his attempt to drag me into the same scam that had already cost him money he'd borrowed from other family members. My nephew's face had gone from pale to ashen gray. He realized that not only had his attempt to embarrass me backfired spectacularly, but I'd also exposed his entire web of lies and financial manipulation. There would be no talking his way out of this one. The family dinner continued, but the focus had completely shifted. Instead of enjoying our meal and catching up, we spent the next hour discussing my nephew's behavior and what needed to be done about it. Several relatives mentioned that they would be demanding immediate repayment of money they'd lent him under false pretenses. Update 1. The aftermath of that dinner was swift and severe. My sister contacted me the next morning to apologize profusely for her son's behavior and to assure me that there would be consequences. She'd already confronted him about every lie I'd exposed and demanded he provide a full accounting of all the money he'd borrowed from family members. What she discovered was worse than anyone had imagined. Over the past 6 months, my nephew had systematically borrowed money from nearly every family member, always with a different story about why he needed it. The total amount was close to $15,000, money that multiple relatives had given him believing they were helping with legitimate emergencies or opportunities. My sister was devastated. She'd raised him as a single mother after her divorce and felt responsible for his behavior. She immediately began contacting every family member who had lent him money to apologize and work out repayment plans. Since she couldn't afford to pay back the full amount immediately, she arranged to have money deducted from her own paycheck to gradually reimburse everyone he'd scammed. But the most significant consequence came from my parents. They'd been planning to help him with a down payment on his first apartment, a gift they'd been saving for over 2 years. After learning about his deception, they decided to redirect that money toward paying back the relatives he'd borrowed from instead. They also informed him that any future financial support would be contingent on him demonstrating genuine responsibility and honesty. The rest of the family's reaction was just as harsh. My nephew found himself essentially ostracized from family gatherings for the next several months. Invitations to birthday parties, holiday meals, and other family events stopped coming. When he did show up to events uninvited, conversations would stop, and people would find excuses to be elsewhere. Update 2. 3 months after the dinner incident, I received an unexpected phone call from my nephew. His voice was barely above a whisper as he asked if we could meet somewhere private to talk. Despite everything that had happened, I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop near my house. The young man who sat across from me was almost unrecognizable from the cocky person who had tried to embarrass me at dinner. He looked exhausted, humbled, and genuinely remorseful. He started by apologizing for his behavior, acknowledging that he'd been wrong to try to manipulate and embarrass me in front of the family. He explained that the pyramid scheme had initially seemed like a legitimate opportunity to make quick money. He'd been seduced by the promise of easy income and had convinced himself that borrowing money from family to get started was a smart investment. When he realized he'd been scammed, he'd been too embarrassed to admit the truth and had continued the lies to avoid facing the consequences of his poor judgment. The embarrassment and shame had eaten away at him over the months since the dinner. He'd lost his job due to spending too much time trying to recruit people for the pyramid scheme instead of focusing on his work responsibilities. His girlfriend had broken up with him after discovering his financial problems and dishonesty. Most painfully, he damaged relationships with family members who had genuinely cared about him and wanted to help him succeed. He asked if there was any way he could make things right, acknowledging that he understood if I never wanted to have a relationship with him again. He'd already started working 2 part-time jobs to begin paying back the money he owed to family members, and he was seeing a counselor to address what he recognized were deeper issues with honesty and responsibility. I listened to everything he had to say before responding. I told him that while I appreciated his apology, rebuilding trust would take time and consistent actions, not just words. I explained that his attempt to publicly embarrass me had been particularly hurtful because it had tried to weaponize the family's love and concern against me. However, I also acknowledged that everyone makes mistakes, and people can change if they're truly committed to doing the work. I agreed to give him a chance to rebuild our relationship, but only if he continued to demonstrate genuine change through his actions over time. Update 3. It's been over a year since that family dinner, and the situation has evolved in ways I never expected. My nephew followed through on his commitment to change, working consistently to pay back every family member he'd borrowed money from. It took him 8 months, but he managed to repay every penny, often sacrificing his own comfort to make the payments. More importantly, he began attending regular counseling sessions to address the underlying issues that had led to his dishonest behavior. He discovered that his actions had stemmed from a combination of financial insecurity, social pressure to appear successful, and poor decision-making skills that he'd never properly developed. The pyramid scheme incident had been a wake-up call that forced him to confront patterns of behavior he'd been developing since his teenage years. He realized that he'd been using manipulation and deception to avoid dealing with problems rather than facing them head-on. His relationship with the family slowly began to heal as he demonstrated consistent change over months. He started with small gestures, offering to help with family events without being asked, showing up on time and sober to gatherings, and being completely transparent about his finances and job situation when asked. The real turning point came when another family member faced a genuine financial emergency. Instead of asking others for help, my nephew quietly stepped up and offered what assistance he could from his modest earnings. He didn't make a big show of it or seek recognition. He simply helped because it was the right thing to do. My sister was incredibly proud of the changes her son had made, though she remained cautious about trusting him completely. She'd been through too much stress and embarrassment during the initial crisis to let her guard down entirely. But she could see that his efforts to change were genuine and sustained, not just a temporary response to getting caught. As for my relationship with him, we've slowly rebuilt a connection based on mutual respect rather than family obligation. He never again asked me for money or tried to manipulate family situations to his advantage. Instead, he began seeking my advice on career decisions and financial planning, approaching me as someone whose judgment he respected rather than someone he could exploit. The incident taught our entire family valuable lessons about enabling behavior versus actually helping someone. We learned to distinguish between genuine emergencies and manufactured crises, and we developed better communication about family financial matters to prevent future manipulation. Looking back, I'm glad I had the evidence to expose his behavior when I did. While the confrontation was uncomfortable, it ultimately prevented him from continuing down a destructive path that would have hurt both him and other family members even more severely. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their worst impulses, even when they try to make you the villain for setting boundaries. The whole experience reinforced my belief that real family support means helping people become better versions of themselves, not just giving them what they want when they want it. My nephew learned that lesson the hard way, but he did eventually learn it, and that's made all the difference in who he's become today.